Eating Disorders Association's Parent, Family, and Friends webinar series. Today we are presenting eating disorders in the LGBTQ community. My name is Ellen Domingos. I am the Community Outreach Specialist here at NEDA. I'm so pleased to have with us today our wonderful presenters, and I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce each one of them. Chase Banister is a licensed clinical social worker, a certified eating disorder specialist by the International Association of Eating Disorders Professionals, and is the co-founder, vice president, and chief clinical officer of Veritas Collaborative, a specialty behavioral health hospital for young people with eating disorders. Chase earned concurrent graduate degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Duke University. After completing residencies in clinical social work at Duke University Medical Center and Duke University's Counseling and Psychological Services, Chase joined Stacy McIntyre in 2006 to establish and develop a specialized EBT-based clinical program for Carolina House. Chase is a member of the Academy of Eating Disorders, International Association of Eating Disorders Professionals, and the Eating Disorder Coalition. He is the former clinical director of Residential Eating Disorders Treatment Center and is the medical advisory board member and board vice president of Mental Fitness Incorporated. He is also a member of Weight Stigma Stakeholders Group, leading a national effort for strategic policy change. Hi, Chase. Thank you so much for being here today.
It is my absolute privilege to be among you. And I sound really cool sometimes when those things are read out loud.
You do. Okay, and now we have Troy. Troy Roness has become a nationally acclaimed writer, voice, and advocate since his 2009 recovery from a life-threatening addiction to exercise and eating disorder after a guest appearance on the Dr. Phil Show. He has been a dedicated national and international activist and educator for eating disorders, recovery, faith, LGBT issues, and healthy body image. Troy serves as the secretary for the National Eating Disorders Association's Junior Board, education director for Normal in Schools Incorporated, the former United States Male Advisory Board member and facilitator for the Global Eating Disorders Organization Mentor Connect, and former advisory board member for the National Association of Males with Disorders. Hi, Troy. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, and next we have Ryan. Ryan Sallans, MA, is a public speaker, diversity trainer, consultant, publisher, and author specializing in healthcare, campus inclusion, and workplace issues surrounding the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning community. Over the past 14 years, Ryan has conducted over 1,000 presentations and trainings to diverse audiences, including professionals, students, and the general public. After his appearance in the documentary Gender Rebel, featured on the Logo channel, Ryan began traveling to universities where he shares the story of his transition from female to male and his recovery from anorexia nervosa. The story is told with an intermixing of humor and intricate clinical details surrounding the transition process. Ryan has also been interviewed twice on Larry King Live, Trisha, Ricky, the new Ricky Lake Show, Huffington Post Live, and NPR. In 2012, Ryan released his memoir, Second Son, Transitioning Toward My Destiny, Love, and Life. Ryan attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he received a Bachelor of Arts in English and Anthropology, a Master of Arts in English, and a Master of Arts in Educational Psychology. And you can learn more about Ryan and his work by visiting his website, ryansallans.com. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here.
Of course, anytime.
Okay, so before we get started, just want to explain the control panel. Right now, you should all be looking at a slide of the control panel. And we have all of our attendees on mute right now to control the background noise. But we really encourage you to participate in this webinar by asking your questions. We want to provide you with the information that you need and are looking for. So please don't hesitate. You can use your raise your hand icon and ask a question that way. Or you're also invited to type in questions by using the chat function. And we'll have questions time for questions throughout the webinar and also at the end of the webinar. If for some reason we don't get your question, we will make sure to forward them on to our presenters and provide you with the answers after. So now I'm going to hand over the presentation to Chase. Chase, I'm going to give you the keyboard.
Dun, dun, dun.
And there you go.
Oh, cool. Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you to Nita for hosting this webinar. This is so cool that we're taking time to speak about such an important issue. And Troy and Ryan are, frankly, you guys are rock stars. So I feel really privileged to be on a panel with you. I like to call this the gay agenda. And so we've been graciously invited to be in this conversation to talk about the LGBTQ community and eating disorders in 1.5 hours, which I don't, is how in the world are we going to do that? Well, we are going to try to find a way. And yes, I can hear you gasping. NITA staff, worry not. We are going to handle it. We are going to get through a lot of this information because it is so important. For me, though, I think it's always important to note that though we are going to work toward a common sort of philosophical language, a common speak, different accents, as it were, are welcomed. And I think that's important. And speaking of different accents, if I can make it work. Oh. Do I have control here?
That's okay. I got it for you.
Okay. Technical difficulties. Excellent. And see, that's how I feel about technology sometimes. This is just a moment to acknowledge our feelings, and I'll say my feeling particularly and bias about what's happened of late with The Biggest Loser. Many of you have been a part of the blogosphere, or you have been seeing the news about the events where really imprudent behaviors were recommended by this television show, very voyeuristic television show. And I'm really grateful, of course, that people are talking about it and that there is a bit of public outrage about what is happening to people and their bodies. At the same time, I want to make sure that as we have an opportunity as a NITA organization to remember to have empathy and kindness for the human being who's been a part of this. Because we're going to talk about shame in a little while, and her experience both as a person who lived in a larger body and a person who is now living in a much smaller body, there's shame all around. So just that's going to be a theme we come back to. Thank you. Just as a practical primer on eating disorders, most folks know this information, but I just, wanted to have on the screen for you the basics of what the new DSM-5, what the criteria would be for each eating disorder: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder, and then there's other specified eating disorders, because as we know, not everybody in the world fits in one particular grouping. That might also be a theme we'll hear today, and unspecified eating disorders. These are sort of the illnesses that we treat, and certainly that have been my experience over the years treating. But what we're going to talk about today is going to involve more than just psychopathology of persons with eating disorders. We're going to talk about part of the human condition and part about what happens with body image for all of our patients, whether they have full-on diagnosis of eating disorder or not. And the reality is that there is so much at stake. in this conversation. Eating disorders are the most lethal of all psychiatric illnesses. I know that many of you who have been a part of NEDA webinars or have been to NEDA events or to IADEP events or Academy for Eating Disorders, or you may have heard that line over and over and over, but there's just not enough we can do to say that enough. That these disorders do kill folks, and the mortality rate for persons with eating disorders is 12 times that of their peers, 12 times. Now, we're watching television and someone says, oh gosh, you are twice as likely to, get toenail fungus if you do this or this or this or this. And we go, oh no, we can't do that, or we'll get toenail fungus because it's just twice as likely. When it reaches numbers like 12, or when we talk about suicide rate being 19 times, or now we think actually more than that, greater, our brains don't really know what to do with that. It's just not comprehensible what 1,200% or 1,900% would be. And the average age of onset of these illnesses is getting younger, and 12 to 13 years old across the spectrum of eating disorders. And these folks are among us every day. And so we just are going to spend some time talking a little bit about that. But then right now, I think we're going to turn it over to Troy. So Troy, my friend.
Yes, sir. Well, my situation is not, it's of course, specific to me, but I think it's specific to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals out there. I began struggling with extreme body image issues and compulsive exercise and anorexia when I was roughly 18 or 19 years old, and wasn't diagnosed with a full-blown eating disorder until I was roughly 22 years of age. So I was kind of in the throes of an eating disorder for the majority of 4 years of my life without knowing it, without realizing it. And I happened to be a gay man, and so for me, I hadn't come out of the closet at that time. I hadn't really looked at a lot of the issues that could have been at root of my eating disorder. And looking back, I'm now 27 years old, and I did go to residential treatment. I did outpatient therapy for a few years, and throughout my therapy, I didn't even talk about my sexuality up until I was 25. And so I think that, sexuality and other experiences, whether it be relational issues, biological issues, and whether it's teasing or bullying and your environment, I think that eating disorders are the result of a plethora of issues growing up. And so I can look back being very young, junior high, and even younger, being very aware of my body and not feeling like I fit in or that I was good enough. And so when I started to struggle with my eating disorder at the age of 18 and 19, I was controlling everything I possibly could through my body. I was trying to mold my body and change my body because I was unable to mold and change the inside, or what I couldn't change, which was my sexuality. And I think a lot of the internalized homophobia, shame, and then the relationship that I had with faith. My personal faith was a huge obstacle in terms of not faith itself was to blame, but my interpretation of that faith. And so my mindset was completely on what is everybody going to think, what is everybody else, what are their thoughts on my illness, on how I look, on what I do or I do not do. And so their perceptions of me, and then of course the thought that I had, if I'm not good enough for God, then whom can I be good enough for? That really translated into a really self-destructive cycle in terms of my eating disorder behaviors, and going down that a pretty rough path for quite some time. But it's definitely turned around quite a bit. I want to put that out there, that there is always hope. There is always something to look forward to no matter where you're at in recovery. I think recovery is a term that's defined by many different individuals in a different way. For one person, it could be simply getting out of bed in the morning, and another individual, it might be not engaging in a behavior for a certain amount of time. And so my message today is not only to share my personal experience, but also to offer insight into hope to those individuals that feel like they don't have a voice or have a story, and that each of our stories are unique, but that we all have similarities and we all can relate to one another as well.
Thank you so much, Troy. Thank you for being here and for sharing your story and providing hope to those who are listening. And I'd like to now Ryan and have Ryan share his story.
All right. Well, just briefly so that we can move forward. At age 19, I walked into my very first therapy appointment in my life because prior to that, I grew up in a family that saw therapists as being crazy people. No offense to anybody on the line. And now I'm married to a therapist, so it's kind of funny. But at age 19, I walked into that office, and at the time, I was female. I felt lost. I felt displaced. I felt scared, and I felt frustrated because my whole life I grew up feeling like I didn't fit in and feeling like I did not fit with my parents' approval. I did not receive my parents' approval due to what it was I felt passionate about, due to the way that I dressed, due to the way that I wanted to act, that did not fall along the lines of being feminine and being pretty and being ladylike. I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa at that time because I was trying to fit into what I believed was, for me, femininity. And through 6 years of therapy, I was able to find what it was that I didn't understand before, that I didn't have language for before. And that really began 4 years into my therapy process and into my recovery when I looked at the word that scared me the most, and that was sexuality. Having very limited education and access to sexuality as a child, I felt that that was something that we shouldn't talk about. And I felt that my attraction to other women was something that would not be accepted by my parents, by my community, and by other people that I came into interaction with, including my therapist. I feared that she wouldn't accept that either. But finally, after 4 years of therapy, I started to explore sexuality. A year after exploring it internally, I came out to my therapist as a lesbian, which saying lesbian was very hard for me to do at that time, but it was a step in a direction that took me where I am today. With coming out as lesbian, I was able to meet some people in the community. I started dating a woman, and when I did that, I started to notice that my behaviors around food were ending. But I became very frustrated because although my behaviors were ending, I still struggled with negative body image, negative self-talk, and suicidal ideation that was with me all the time. In fact, most of my college career, I can't think of times where I didn't have suicide ideation following me every day. After 8 months of exploring this, I ended up in a bookstore in Boston, and I found a book on transgender men. I looked at that word for the first time, not as a word, but as an identity through the photographs of the transgender men in that book, and I finally understood who I was. And so then 5 months later, I began my transition to male. And I'm now 9 years into my transition, and I am now 9 years behavior-free from my eating disorder. The negative body image stuff still follows me, and there's other issues that still follow me, but I work very hard every day to try to explore those.
Thank you, Ryan, so much. It's such a powerful story. Thank you for taking the time to share it with all of our attendees. And I'll turn it over to Chase again.
Absolutely, and I feel so similarly. What a gift to hear both of your stories, and they are so incredibly hopeful and hope-giving. And the clinician part of me that we're going to talk, a little bit about brain science and all those kinds of things. But the human side of me, and yes, therapists and clinicians are human, and also crazy, Ryan, as you mentioned. I totally agree with you. In fact, on my desk right now is a big sign that says, imperfection is beauty, madness is genius, and it's better to be absolutely ridiculous than absolutely boring. And so, philosophy of life. The human side of me, the chills run up and down my spine, not only because of your, the hope that your stories that you've shared impart, but moreover for your willingness to express that kind of vulnerability for others who may be in such a similar situation. Both of you, my authentic and sincere thanks. There is maybe no greater gift that you give than that. And so let's nerd out for a few minutes, really, and I'll try to scoot through some of this. There's some of this information. I should say there are lots of folks in the world. There are the scientists, thank goodness. What would we do without the scientists and the researchers who continually study, try to figure out what's going on with body image concerns, with eating disorder issues. And I just want to basically give a shout out to all those folks because we wouldn't be where we are. We couldn't talk about what we're talking about without their contributions. A lot of the things we know about what happens with eating disorder illnesses is that there's actually a loss of brain mass due to malnourishment or volume depletion, meaning that without respect to the diagnosis, not just anorexia nervosa, but also bulimia nervosa, also binge eating disorder, there are sort of deficits and damage done to the brain that create impairments to all of those wonderful chemicals that are supposed to do wonderful things, like serotonin, for example. Well, serotonin we think of as a feel-good chemical. Well, if we're not thoughtful about it, someone with anorexia nervosa, and we give them, a lot of carbohydrates all at once, it's going to send lots and lots and lots of serotonin into the brain. It's going to go into what we call the exogenous regions. Those wrong parts of the brain shouldn't be there way too much, and it feels awful. Thanks to Walt Kay for a lot of his work on this and continued work on it. And without respect to a particular disorder, the group of eating disorders creates actual and physiological changes. To talk a little bit about the neuropsychological changes, there are, I won't go through all of this. I am not a neurologist, or neurophysiologist or any ologist really, and so, but there are some basic parts of the brain that deal with different sort of interoceptive cues like satiety cues, or that amygdala that deals with the fight, flight, freeze response in the limbic system, the hippocampus about our ability to hold on to what we learn, that prefrontal cortex where the executive functioning happens right above your eyebrows, where we make decisions, where we make meaning out of the world, the striatum where there's the reward mechanism, feeling a high, being able to feel sated. Each of these parts of the brain is affected through malnutrition and through eating disorder behaviors. And so we're really talking about actual biophysiological change. And as I was talking about the researchers earlier, these are really, really complex disorders. And if nothing else comes home, it's important to say this. And here are these are pictures of some of the smartest people I know in the field of eating disorders, and thank goodness for them. And each of them knows that this is these are complex illnesses that are, it's more than just media. It's a combination of our genetic makeup. It's a combination of our brain chemistry. It's a combination of our environment. Our environment then can impact our genetic structure. That's that emerging field of epigenetics, where the environment we're in can actually change our genetic structure. And so the old argument of nature versus nurture is sort of I consider that sort of boring, because right now it's both. And in the field of eating disorders. I did put a mirror. I want you to see the mirror. Oh, look at the mirror. And that mirror is actually to say that you are also brilliant. Many of you on the line may know way more about this than I, and some of you have your own stories to tell in different ways, so you're one of the smart people. By the numbers in the U.S., more than 8 million people, which is roughly 4% of the U.S. population, identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Now, I should say, these numbers are guesstimates from a lot of different folks. There are a lot of people who put a lot of different numbers out there. But this is the best information that we have. Please know that there might be other sources that would say somewhat differently. A further 700,000 folks identify as transgender in the U.S. And I say by the power of mathematics, because my sister is a professor of mathematics, this means that there are at least 9 million, and I put million, if you notice. That's not exactly mathematically correct, but 9 million LGBTQ folks in the U.S. Beyond that, there are others who've engaged in same-sex sexual behavior or acknowledge same-sex attraction in some way, and those folks are not necessarily accounted for in those earlier numbers. And we're going to transition in just a moment to talking a little bit more about words. And as I believe Brian's going to do some of that for us, I want to share one of my favorite Alan Greenspan quotes, which is, I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant, which is a very thoughtful way of saying you ain't listening, and you need to listen more carefully, please. So, Ryan, I would invite you to share some of your wisdom about the importance of words and how we use that in this conversation.
Well, I first feel it's important for us to recognize that language is constantly evolving and changing, and it may take on different meanings within the different regions that we all live. We've put this slide up here just to show the different terms that people may be using in the LGBTQ community, and to be open and aware of what this language may mean for that individual. So we have the title of the presentation, LGBTQ, but we also see there's another Q thrown in there, then an I, and a couple A's, and a couple P's. Some people joke that pretty soon we're going to have alphabet soup with the LGBT community due to all the letters we're throwing in for our acronym. But we're just going to review them very quickly. Many people may know lesbian means women who are in emotional, affectionate, romantic relationships with other women. Gay, men who are in emotional, affectionate relationships with other men. Bisexual are individuals that are attracted to both men and women. Bisexual individuals oftentimes state that they feel very marginalized in the community. They feel that their identity is not recognized or accepted by the heterosexual community or the lesbian gay community, and that they may lose friendships depending on what relationship they're in. For example, a woman who's in a relationship with another woman may be able to go out with her lesbian friends, but if she breaks up with that person and starts dating a man, suddenly her lesbian friends are not calling her up or inviting her to events anymore, so they can feel very isolated in that sense. And the transgender community can also feel very marginalized in this community. The main reason for that being, when we talk about transgender, we're talking about gender identity and expression, which we're going to talk about in a second, versus lesbian, gay, bisexual, or the other terms we're looking at are looking at sexual orientation, which are two different things. And then we see the word queer. And some people may have an adverse reaction to this word, may feel that we shouldn't be using it because it's derogatory. In the 1990s, activists started reclaiming the word queer as something empowering and powerful, to the point that today we're seeing many people use it as the umbrella term for the LGBT community. And this is important because if a person says they're lesbian or gay, you will have a pretty clear image in your mind what that means, but if they say they're queer, it leaves things undefined. It allows for some more fluidity, some more flexibility with one's identity. Questioning is also put in there for people that aren't sure how they identify, but they want to be in the space. They want to be at the table to explore that. Intersex is a term that may be part of the community, but again, many people that are intersex may not identify as being part of the community. And this is a term that in the old days we used the word hermaphrodite to describe, but today we use intersex or disorders of sex development. And it's just where a person's biological sex, there's a different composition of how they develop. But then we see the word asexual, and this is another term that some people may not be as familiar with. Asexual individuals are individuals that do not have sexual attraction towards other people. That does not mean that they are not a sexual being. Doesn't mean they may not. Doesn't mean they won't potentially experience sexual pleasure with themselves. But they don't have sexual attraction towards other people. Ally are heterosexual individuals that are friends and supporters of the community. And then we have the P's, polysexual and pansexual. Pan means all, poly means most. So pansexual individuals are individuals that say, I don't care what's between a person's legs. I'm attracted to people for who they are, not what their gender is. Okay, so a little bit, that's just an overview of the language. We'll go to the next slide really quick. And just quickly to understand more of the complexities of sexuality, I think it's important for us to recognize the differences between these terms. Oftentimes in our society, we interchange the word sex and gender to mean the same thing, but they actually mean two different things. Sex refers to the composition of a person's internal and external anatomy, their chromosome makeup, and the hormones that run their body. That's our biological sex, and oftentimes we talk about male, female, but we also have the intersex community, which we have between 40 to 60 conditions in that community. Now, gender refers to, one, our gender identity, which is our psychological sense of self or gender, and two, our gender expression, which is the way that we communicate that gender. All right. Gender identity is biological. We are born with it. Typically between ages 2 to 3, we start having a sense of it. 4 to 6, we're very creative and exploring. 5 to 7, we start to have more concrete sense of what our gender is. And then by ages 9 to 12, that gender identity becomes fixed. So that's biological. That's nature, not nurture. Gender expression, on the other hand, is nurture and socially constructed. So the ways that we view gender expression as far as what we think of traditional male or female may be very different if you go to another culture. And then lastly, our sexual orientation. This is not necessarily correlated to one's gender identity or gender expression, meaning you could have someone who's biologically born a male who has a gender identity of a man, expresses himself in a very feminine way, and identifies as heterosexual and attracted to women. Or vice versa, let's just say you could have a hyper-masculine woman who's attracted to men and identifies as heterosexual, or asexual, or bisexual, or pansexual. They're not necessarily correlated, so it's important for us not to assume how people identify based on stereotypes. Next slide. And when we talk about transgender, it's important to understand that transgender has become the umbrella term, and there's over 100 trans identities out there, all right? So different terms like gender queer, gender fluid, cross-dresser are terms that could fall underneath this umbrella. Transsexual is also a term that falls underneath the transgender umbrella, but when it was first coined, it's coined for people whose gender identity is different from the sex they are born at or assigned at birth, and they may choose to use hormones and surgeries to align their body with their mind, because you can change the body, but you cannot change the brain. So, for example, I myself would be considered a transsexual because I transitioned from female to male. Language that people may use in the transsexual community include M2F, which means born assigned male but transitioned to female, or they may use the term trans woman. F to M would be someone like myself, born assigned female at birth but transitioned to male. Many people use the word trans man today. And then in academia and some research, and especially within the blogosphere, we're starting to see the word trans with an asterisk. This is starting to become more of the umbrella term for the transgender community. Reason being is that many people are now assigning the word transgender to the transsexual community and leaving out the 99 other trans identities that are out there. So putting that asterisk there is reminding us, hey, there's more than just one identity underneath this umbrella.
And thank goodness that this is Chase talking. That we're not speech prescriptivists here. We cannot be identity prescriptivists here. We have to be able to adapt and change as we learn and more about how humans operate. And I will express my own vulnerability to say, there are still parts of this that I, as we talk about it, will get wrong. One of my favorite parts of the slide that talked about me in ridiculous terms was the last point that said that I reserve the right to be wrong because I'm going to be. And I may use a word that's inappropriate. And I've told Ryan and Troy to interrupt me and tell me when I do that. And I ask all your participants, feel free to call me out on that because I'm learning too as part of this. I always feel that it's when I'm trying to figure out how to talk about something, I always look to Audre Lorde because she's brilliant. And she says that as a black lesbian feminist, comfortable with the many different ingredients of my identity, and as a woman committed to racial and sexual freedom from oppression, I find I'm constantly being encouraged to pluck out some one aspect of myself and present this as a meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of self. But this is a destructive and fragmenting way to live. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all the parts of who I am. And I quote that from her, which she shared in 1984, because we're actually talking a lot today about particularity, but I don't want us to lose, and Troy and Ryan and the folks that don't want us to lose the sense that as we talk about particularity, we're not losing persons in their wholeness. But in order to talk about the way that LGBTQ persons are particularly affected by these illnesses, we do have to reach into the language a bit. So heteronormativity is another we're going to hear a lot about. And bottom line with that is it's a belief system that says that the heterosexual way of life is the normal sexual orientation. And you can think of many things, like maybe tax returns, or in a bridal registry, husband and wife, or bride and groom being listed everywhere. Those are examples of a heteronormative world where the society has just sort of agreed that there are natural roles in life. This heteronormativity, we're going to learn, becomes really problematic for a psychological formation of eating disorders. And y'all, it is really stressful out there for young folk and all folk these days. But particularly, I mean, I love this picture of what I imagine is a high schooler or maybe a college freshman who is under so much stress to get the paper done, to develop friendships, to, there may be stuff going on in the family, there are physical changes, there's the love and the heartbreak that happens, there's the seriousness of bullying. The pace of social interchange is happening so rapidly. If you're not knowing what's on Snapchat or DoChat or InstaChat or whatever it's called, then you're lost. We also have an achievement identity where people are defined by what they are able to do in this world, not who they are. So we sort of deal with human, sort of a human doing rather than a human being. And there also, of course, come with this pressures to be certain sizes and shapes. This goes across the spectrum for persons, be they LGBTQ or straight. And anxiety is really the new normal. And this is seen everywhere, particularly in schools. An educational race to the top is something that's going on right now. Race to the top of what? I always ask the question when we're trying to figure out who's doing the best, who's doing the most work, who's the busiest. Well, when you get into one of those kind of arguments, what do you get if you win? And it's very important for us to remember that sometimes we might end up being bullies of our young persons, and that our children and our adolescents are actually more likely when that anxiety to live into this social sort of social achievement identity structure are likely to take that out on their body much more than persons who are middle-aged or older. LGBTQ folks, and see, here's another example. I left off a Q. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, there are a lot of other parts and other words we could, and excuse me, letters we could put up there. And you'll see that's one of my failures here. LGBTQ persons are at higher risk for depression, for anxiety, for substance abuse disorders, which, by the way, are risk factors for eating disorders. And LGBT persons are about a little more than twice as likely than their heterosexual peers to have mood or anxiety or substance abuse disorders in their lifetime. By the way, for the risk factors for eating disorders, LGBT persons who experience interpersonal trauma and sexual discrimination have an increased likelihood of engaging in suicidal and other non-suicidal self-injury. And yet, you guessed it, these are the sort of things that we see correlative with eating disorders. And it's one thing to mention here is that it's really important to know that when we talk about these things, we're at higher risk for this, that, or the other. That we ask the question, what does it mean to be narrated? That your identity is narrated as risk. That's a larger question that we may have time for another day, but I've seen a lot. Well, LGBT persons are at risk for, blank, or persons who smoke are more likely to, get lung cancer. But you don't see many articles that say LGBTQ persons are at risk for being awesome. Those aren't papers that are being written right now, which we need more of. There is clearly an impact of pressure and stigma in the world for LGBT persons. And LGBT persons in their lives are regularly stigmatized and regularly devalued by society. I mean, we can look no further than what's on all over the television right now of the, the you're looking at the Olympics right now, and I mean, just how clear of an issue LGBT concerns have been in the athletic community in our world right now. And if you didn't see any of the YouTube videos about how much violence is being wrought upon LGBT persons there, it's a serious issue. This is not just made up. This is very real for lots of people, and it's not just extra U.S. I mean, these are happening in major cities and rural towns all over the U.S. Societal promotion of those heterocentric norms, or like the right way or the acceptable way to be, and and folks are exposed to a tremendous amount of negative messaging about their desires, their identity, the way they express their identity, and constantly just shamed by that because of being different. Now, I want to bring up something that a concept that I have always found to be very helpful when I'm thinking about LGBTQ population with eating disorders, and that's the concept of minority stress. And I clearly cannot take credit for coming up with such a wonderful term. Dr. Meyer from Columbia University did a great job sort of delineating what this was about. But it's a prejudice directed toward minorities. And that is stressful, and it may lead to adverse mental health outcomes. The point of that being is that that minority stress is additive, that it's something that has been done to a community that then results in something deleterious, something harmful, something hurtful happening to that group they didn't ask for, but happened nonetheless. It's socially based. It's always around us, and it is unique, and not unique in the sense of that it's just on the one kind of minority stress, but unique in that there's enough stress going on already, like the kid in the other slide who's got books everywhere, that it's on top of everything else that's going on in their world. I just love this guy. Also, I want to say, this is the kind of face we see all the time, and or many times when folks come into therapy. Stressed? I'm not stressed. Nope, not me. Anxious? I'm not anxious. I'm completely calm. Not neurotic. Not OCD. I'm peachy keen. Thanks. And really, and then of course, counterpart. I'm totally fine. Yeah. So with this, and for the clinicians who are on the call, this is stuff that I know, but we have to be listening for what's behind the words, of course, and not necessarily just to the words themselves. And that is particularly prudent and salient to folks with the LGBTQ population, because they're often sort of living in a world where they're having to keep lots of things quiet and lots of things closeted, lots of things secret, and so smiling and pretending and going on with her or his life is the norm, not the exception. And things aren't fine. I'm grateful for Maryland Department of Health, Mental Health and Hygiene, for really doing a great study, and then, of course, creating graphs. And when you can create graphs and charts that are beautiful, that I stole, but at least I give credit for, in Maryland, 25 documented anti-LGBTQ homicides in 2012. 53% of those were of transgender women. 73% of all anti-LGBTQ homicide victims were persons of color. So, as Audre Lorde pointed out earlier, it is very difficult, of course, to pluck out one aspect of self and present that as a meaningful whole and sort of deconstruct the body. One of the things the Maryland study does here is point out that it reaches to sort of many of our places of discrimination. We're going to talk about a number of different parts of the community, and again, understand, Ryan, thank you again for helping us learn of language, and we're not going to cover everything as thoroughly as it could be. But we're going to talk about particular communities. And first, the gay or bisexual males with eating disorders, and among males suffering from an eating disorder, depending on who you talk to, but up to about 42% identify themselves as gay or bisexual. Now, that's statistically weird to me, because if roughly 6% of the total U.S. male population identifies as gay or bisexual, but yet those that identify for eating disorder care or with an eating disorder are 42%, that's really strange. And homosexuality is thus implicated as a risk factor for eating disorder development. And like I was saying a little bit earlier, I call this a philosophical quandary. What does it mean to have one's identity reduced to a risk factor? As I encounter the language and the literature that's out there, it's always a risk factor this, a risk factor for that, and I'm wondering if also Ryan and Troy, if you have any thoughts about what do you think about that, about having your identity be narrated as a risk factor?
Well, I'll go first. I think that even thinking back to one of your slides where you showed the image of a person and you had all the circles circling around them showing peers, family, culture, religion, my identity is not the risk factor, just like being transgender is not a mental illness. Where we see these problems coming in my opinion, is the way that society treats people in the LGBT community, the messages that we receive, and the lack of acceptance, even within our own homes, that we may experience for being LGBT, and that fear of even coming out, that fear of not being loved, that fear of being rejected that follows.
Wow. Wow. And as we sort of think about gay, bisexual, and queer-identified young males compared with straight young males are, who identify as gay are significantly more likely to engage in behaviors that are related to disordered eating, fasting, or restricting food, purging by vomiting or laxatives, or maybe compulsive exercise, taking diet pills, those sorts of things, in order to control body weight, shape, size, and appearance. And there are social norms in gay male communities, and this sort of spans the literature that talks about this. By the way, of which there's a lot. I say a lot in context. If you're going to discuss a part of the LGBTQ community and eating disorders, gay males are the easiest to find information upon, and I wonder what kind of internalized and societal misogyny might be at work there. But that's a story for another day. There's a constant pressure to meet an unrealistic, unattainable standard. Wherever one looks, in the media, the airbrushing, we know all this happens when all of the images that our teenagers and young people and adults are seeing about what's quote-unquote good, what's quote-unquote bad. I found it interesting that among adult gay men, the more one was involved in community activities and organizations, things like HRC or maybe your local gay pride parade, something like that, has been positively associated with body dissatisfaction, which is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. That there might be a byproduct of finding, of our community building and connecting might have a troublesome byproduct of making us more dissatisfied. And my take on this is that we talk a lot about bodies, and in these different environments, the comparisons happen, and it really becomes tremendously impactful upon one's health. What is it that influences this hyper-focus on gay males and their appearance and body? There's maybe an internalized misogyny, as you're talking about earlier. Maybe there's a desire to bulk up for personal safety reasons. I put here the reaction to the HIV/AIDS crisis. I started my professional career working in an infectious disease, particularly with HIV illnesses in minority populations. There was a constant in that community of desire to bulk and be bulked up and have tone and have lots of muscle so that they would not be assumed to have HIV or AIDS, which, as we know, the lipodystrophy and the muscle wasting that happens with that. There was a desire to distance themselves from that. There's just an inundation, of course, of artificial bodies, media, and pornography. All of that, folks that that really ultimately aren't real. And then there is a loneliness factor that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. That there is a desire to connect, and when one is lonely, one will do whatever it takes to be a part of community and to be able to be accepted and develop friendships. And this is particularly true in rural communities, for sure. Now, some of you may have been like I was not that long ago, thinking about the paradoxical thinness, which is talked about in gay male literature a lot with eating disorders, that there's this weird desire to be both very thin and very muscular at the same time, and that was unique to the gay male experience. Well, actually, right now, interesting, this is being turned on its head a little bit, that's the concept of paradoxical thinness really applies, is shared equally among all males, be they gay, straight, bisexual, what have you. And so that may be less an issue of LGBT and more of a cultural society and societal norm that we're creating for males. With mental health and body image, I mean, gay men have been thought to have to be more affected, that is, by traditionally the female Western body image concerns. They have been connected, as is the fear we noticed earlier of that internalized misogyny, a fear of being connected with the effeminate. But that's the connection that's been made. And lesbian women were thought to be protected from eating disorders or disturbed body image. I find that absolutely fascinating, that lesbian women were thought to be protected from eating disorders or body image. And you know, as I think about this a lot, you know, some lesbians have reported, you know, improved body image after coming out, noting a sense of freedom from heterosexual or this beauty mandate that's set free, as it were, excuse me, set free, as it were, from the common feminine struggle, being able to reject that outright. However, a lot of lesbians continued to struggle with the internalization, continued to worry, continued to have this pervasive thin ideal. And so, you know, this can result in the development of body hatred and eating disorders, of course, always, whenever one internalizes the pervasive thin ideal. And Feldman and Meyer, several years ago now, really put this in its best terms that I could find, that many believed that sexual minority women were less invested in conventional beauty norms, but this narrow view has not been substantiated in literature because these women are subjected to the same ideals of beauty as every other woman. It is unclear how internalized these ideals became and it most likely varies based on, of course, individual identity. These findings seem to indicate that sexual minority women may be just as likely to present with eating disorders as heterosexual women. And so that's the taboo that, and sort of the conundrum that many folks who are lesbian and have eating disorder concerns find themselves in. It's because they find themselves in a community that is, quote unquote, rejected sometimes the concept of body image and the thin ideal as maybe a straight woman's thing or a gay man's thing. And so they don't really talk about it within their own communities. And they're isolated within their own communities. Naomi Tucker, of course, as you see here, really theorizes this best in saying that that isolation perpetuates this problem. And so I think it deserves talking about. And some voices, actually some quotes I found helpful from folks who are, you know, like Jenny, who's 30. Healthcare workers need to show more interest in lesbian health issues. At present, it seems very focused on pregnancy, contraception, STI issues, prevention, which they generally perceive are heterosexual women's issues. And when I go to the doctor, I feel like I'm not very important to them as a lesbian woman. Now, I've seen 2 different therapists, says Kira, this year, and neither of them raised my sexuality as something that might have an impact on my mental health. I felt as if they might not even know how to raise it because they were heterosexual and didn't understand what might and might not arise as issues or problems. And you know, for the clinicians and therapists that I might have on the line and that are with us, we really may need to take heed of some of their language. I know I do, which means that sometimes we present as I'm a clinical social worker, so I'm accepting of everything, says the NASW Code of Ethics, and yet there are still things that I don't really know about and that I might nod and smile about in the therapy room when I really might need to ask more questions. The bottom line is that lesbians have been left out. They've been left out of the literature. You may remember me saying that gay males and talking about gay males was the easiest group to find. The hardest group to find information on is lesbians with eating disorder or body concerns, body image, or eating disorders. That's a problem. And I really hope that what we're going to do is, I hope that we will see more sort of more research around this, and what I call Understatement 2013. These results call attention to lesbians as a generally understudied population, and those of us, in the LGBT community who may not be L, have a responsibility to stand up for those voices. That was a soapbox, and I'm going to own it. To talk about the trans community a bit, there's, certainly a discrepancy sometimes between the seeing the self and feeling of the self. And a lot of this was covered earlier and beautifully about the differences between gender identity and gender presentation and what might happen there. So we'll sort of skip ahead a little bit and just note that there's a gap in training in eating disorders and LGBTQ populations as a whole. Now, this affects trans people, interestingly, maybe most of all. 70% of med schools and pre-med schools as well, programs surveyed said that they covered gender identity in their curricula. But only 35% of those same schools noted that transitioning and those endocrine issues that are related to that were covered in the coursework. So you've got 70%, which I'm excited, at least. I mean, we're getting somewhere. It's not enough. It's not the 99.99 that I would prefer. But 70% are talking about gender identity, but half of those are talking about the issues that are interrelated with that. There is a paucity of research. And both biologically male, biologically female transsexuals report severe body dissatisfaction, changing, this is another understatement, this time in 2002, changing the eating disorder behavior like fasting or dieting or vomiting might be an inadequate strategy to reduce stress and modify the body and the sexuality. This was written by a group that was not necessarily eating disorder specialists, though it was published in the International Journal of Eating Disorders, really presenting for gender identity disorders, but noticed the body dissatisfaction and said, we have to talk about this somehow. Though at seriously increased risk for eating disorders, very little has been published about the unique treatment needs of transgender transsexual patients with eating disorders. And I'll skip over that long quote right there and go to the next one, eating disorders and transition. An article, I'm actually looking at it on my desk because I'm a geek, and so I don't mind that term. The International Journal of Eating Disorders arrived a few days ago for issue 1, volume 47, January 2014, and the last article in here is a case report. This is by Ewan, Middleton, and Feldman, and the name of the report: Treatment of Anorexia Nervosa in the Context of Transsexuality, a case report. How cool is this? And though it was a case report, and not particularly a control trial or anything like that, its bottom line statement was that we may want to consider using sort of the endocrine society guidelines and helping persons transition as part of the eating disorder recovery process. What they describe in their article is that treatment teams who were able to help initiate the medical treatment involved in transitioning were really, it was incredibly impactful upon the eating disorder recovery, and and really actually helped for the folks who needed to gain weight, were able to do that. The people who were needed to become asymptomatic had a much easier time doing so. And one might wonder, okay, is this the minority stress maybe factor that's playing a role into this? That, when look at what we have done to a community, the stigma, the shame, and when we found a way, maybe like this article has sort of points to take away the minority stress, to say this is beautiful and good and a part of who you are, then recovery, I won't say magically, but may happen more quickly and may arise. And how cool! Again, it's a case study, one, but I will take anything that gives us hope as we look to the future. There are a lot of barriers for folks getting the care they need who are LGBTQ. Eating disorders are sort of overlooked as a problem for men in general. The literature is geared towards straight women, feeling like I'm the only one. The that there's a myth that queer women do not have eating disorders. There's stigma and shame of having a quote-unquote, and you can't see me, but I'm doing the air quote thing with my fingers, of having a woman's issue for men. And as experienced as a, here are the air quotes again, woman's issue, the eating disorder may trigger childhood wounding around being teased, bullied, being effeminate or different. A fear that going into treatment or care, getting help for all of the bullying, getting some support for all of these things that you don't quite know what to do with, I will be forced out of the closet before I'm ready to do that, or being forced out of denial about it. And denial has its place. There is a time. Some folks need the time, to be able to honor who they are and grow into who they are. And there's just a lack of barriers with LGBTQ cultural competency factors, period. Like I said, we're still having difficulties with the prescriptivism of language around LGBTQ persons, much less really how to deal with that as eating disorders. The next couple of slides are things that apply to pretty much everyone.
Before we move on, this is
Yeah.
Ellen. Sorry to interrupt, but
Hey, Ellen.
Hi. I'd love to hear from Troy and Ryan, their personal, if they can speak to this at all, their personal experience with barriers when they were seeking treatment, or if they can relate to any of these barriers. Troy, do you feel that you had barriers to treatment, or can you relate to any of these?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel that, looking back now, that fear that treatment would definitely force me to talk about things that I was uncomfortable speaking about would definitely be part of the reason why I did not want to come forward. I knew that my sexuality long before I ever talked about it. However, I assumed that by going to treatment or by admitting that I had an issue, that it was considered more effeminate, or that I would be considered, that I would be told that I was gay because I had an eating disorder. And kind of going back a little bit to what we were speaking on earlier in terms of, I think it was 42%, I might be wrong on that quote, but of males that do go to treatment that are gay, between straight and gay. When I do speaking engagements with people, I try to emphasize that by going to treatment as a male, it's difficult enough in and of itself, just because a lot of people do assume that it's a female-only issue, when of course it is not. But at the same time, I think maybe some individuals who are struggling with their sexuality may not want to go because they have to face not only the sexuality issue that they're struggling with or other issues, but also that they will be compared to other individuals, and then our straight counterparts as well will be told that they are more effeminate because they're struggling with body image issues or an eating disorder, which makes them somehow less than, which is completely and utterly false. So I can completely identify with that, and also being misdiagnosed a handful of times by not only general practitioners, but internal specialists and so on. And so I know that even though the word is, it's being talked about not only in the LGBTQ community and men, as much more so, and it needs to be, I think that education is still far, far behind where it needs to be when it comes to medical practitioners. Not entirely at the fault of them, but I think that education has a long way to catch up.
All right, thank you, Troy. That's such an important conversation. And Ryan, would you have anything to add?
Well, I think it's interesting in thinking about my own recovery. I didn't go into treatment. All the work that I did was on my university campus with the eating disorder team and support groups. And I was also involved with the Eating Disorder Education and Prevention Student Organization and the peer educators. And for me, there was fear of, at the time, people seeing me as lesbian because I was trying to find a place to fit in. or even feel like I fit in with the other women that were part of these groups because I was just on a different end of the spectrum than them. But to then come out as a lesbian made me fear that I would be even further othered or marginalized from the group. So sometimes I feel voices may be silenced out of that fear of just not finding any place to belong, not having a community, any community, whether it be the recovery community, your own community, your family unit, not having a place that you can call your home with your peers.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. Now I'll turn it back over to Chase.
Yeah, the concept of otherness and not having a home, the potency of that, and and then who is it that holds the power of home giving and home creation, as a question that I have, and that goes back to the minority stress of not necessarily is the LGBT anything wrong with that at all. What has the greater community done to create stress or to not do things that could mitigate stress for this community? Because it has a very real impact upon bodies. One of the things we know that we didn't know long ago, or that long ago, is that eating disorders do have a genetic component, not just nurture. We used to say it was mothers that caused eating disorders. It was mothers that caused schizophrenia. We called them schizophrenogenic mothers. Interestingly, very few times was there ever a schizophrenic father, but neither here nor there. The concept of latent genetic vulnerability theory, that there's a genetic predisposition to illness and that's heritable, that eating disorders can come through family lines that maybe would be dormant in the brain until switched on. We've already talked a little bit about epigenetics. As we move to the next slide, the things that might switch on the eating disorder behavior, and honest to goodness, I did not intend for this to be so dramatic. I don't know how that happened. The four horse persons of the apocalypse, I call them: dieting, over-exercising, purging behaviors, and the hormones associated with puberty. These are behaviors that really trigger eating disorders to flare up remarkably, and we may be finding out that they may be part of the story of turning on what otherwise would have been a dormant illness in the brain. But again, going back to minority stress, we had a heaping dose of that stress and the shame experienced by LGBTQ persons, because these things, these dieting, over-exercising, purgative behaviors, hormones associated with puberty, these are actually things that most everybody in the world does. But add all the shame and the stress, more of those behaviors are going to happen, and then those horse persons gallop considerably faster. I actually want to. I believe in mistakes. I make a lot of them, and I'm grateful for a community that can be both forgiving and understanding. I've used this slide, as many have over the years, and I call it my completely problematic slide, which is full of problems. Which I could just narrate to you that I really think that it. Number one, I've said that I won't eat, and maybe it's I can't eat, knowing what we know about genetics and knowing what we know about what actually is happening with the body when these disorders become in their most severe forms. Also, that it's about I won't eat versus maybe binging is more the concern, and so that marginalizes folks with binge eating disorder. It's also a European American young female, which is the stereotype of eating disorders, and so I keep this in here as a reminder to myself that while absolutely true, maybe for this young woman, is not fully representative of the spectrum of those folks who suffer. Now, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is shame, and as you encounter this headline that I got off of NBC, last year. Fat shaming may curb obesity, bioethicist says. Actually, I really want to, I'm going to acknowledge some bias. I really want to put air quotes around bioethicist right now. But, okay, so bias acknowledged. And, you know, really, that we're going to elect to shame folks more when we know, as we talked about earlier, that shame is part of the cycle that leads to more eating disorder behaviors. And we're talking about shame from compounded with the LGBTQ community, who have enough shame already to deal with. And you know, this war on obesity that we've waged, there are weapons of shame. And you know, this is an ad about a year ago or so from Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and you know, a blogger actually wrote about this and said, and I quote, these pictures will, in my opinion, do nothing but make kids feel worse and parents feel like shit, end quote. Pardon my language, or the use of that language. I want to draw your attention to the middle picture, and how that might be impactful to LGBTQ persons as they are in that gender awareness, gender identity phase. It's hard to be a little girl if you're not. I don't even know how to deconstruct that. Oh, the ways that we have shamed this young person and her body and maybe her identity, and maybe she doesn't feel like a little girl on the inside. So anyway, that's something that we really do wage war on folks, and young folks particularly. The war on obesity is violence waged on people already entrenched in an endless civil war of shame, which is for many part of binge eating disorder or bulimia nervosa, what have you. And willpower, as the general public sees it, says if you're uncomfortable, change, no matter what the cost. If you're not comfortable, you are not uncomfortable, you probably should be uncomfortable. If you want it badly enough, you can and should just stop it. And I say, you know, wait, hang on. That really sounds awfully familiar. Isn't that what they said about being gay? Just if you want to change, you really can. Here we can just see that shame and disgust is part of a cycle. In this instance, it's bulimia nervosa. Shame and disgust leads to restriction of food, which leads to being hungry, which leads to binge eating on food, which leads to purging that food to avoid weight gain, which leads to more shame and disgust. And so somehow, somewhere, some way, we've decided that to shame young bodies is the way forward. We still have some work to do. I was pleased when I found this image, but I think I might be the only one, that it takes a teen. Anyone? It really does take a community to treat and work with eating disorders, and with LGBTQ persons, you know, particularly. We need psychiatry, pediatric medicine, family and individual psychotherapy, parents and families, parents and families, parents and families, parents and families, I can't say that enough, dietetics and nutrition, specialized psychiatric and medical nursing. And we need each of those groups to have an understanding of minority stress and heteronormativity, heterocentric viewpoints, otherwise known maybe as homophobia, and the impact that that might have upon you know, the recovery journey, and how it might very well stand smack dab in the middle of it. So a few practice tips for, well, really all of us, is to remember to respect the individual's identity, to respect pronouns. If there's a young person who is electing to use she or he or he or some other pronoun, one of the most honoring things you can do is to respect that language. You may not understand it. We may not understand it. And that's all right. There are a lot of things we don't understand in this world, but that's particularly important. If we can honor that, maybe we could, just maybe, take away a little bit of the stigma and the shame. to respect the individual's choice of name, their goals, what they want to do, their confidentiality, which is really, really, really important, particularly as we talk with young people, because, you know, what is it that we have to share with parents? What is it we don't? That's particularly for clinicians, is to really study up on, you know, what contracts can we have with family members so that we can speak appropriately and there's a safe space, you know, and their child remains safe. Of course, privacy and the right to safety. Some hope, actually, in the next slide is to talk about the Family Acceptance Project, which I love, that says that when LGBTQ folks are accepted by their families, when they've done those things before to respect the individual's identity and pronouns and name and goal and confidentiality, privacy, right to safety, they were much more likely to believe they would have a good life. They were much more likely to believe they would have a good life, much more likely to believe that they would be a happy and productive adult. That's the kind of change that can be brought about by actually facing and encountering minority stress and heterocentric views that might just maybe turn down the volume of the stress on a person who is, you know, at risk for eating disorder. So what to do? Let's be aware of bias. Biases, it's important to know, are strengthened when we share them across practice groups and professional organizations. That means that folks like the National Eating Disorders Association, NEDA, American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, you know, all groups like this, these, you know, HRC, you name it, that together they create a groupthink. But particularly within healthcare, if we're not really talking about best practices with these particular communities, and there's bias that we don't name out loud, this statement is incredibly potent to me. It is reasonable to believe that bias then partially explains healthcare disparities. That's what this stigma does to folks. I want to, we end here with just a couple of more slides. You know, ergo, here's my hero. You know, a lot of people know Carl Rogers was the father of person-centered or humanist psychology, is considered by many, and folks who follow Carl Rogers are known as Rogerians often. Well, I am a Rogerian, but I am a Fred Rogerian. I'm looking at his picture on the wall in my office right now, and another sign below it that says, "Realize how good you really are." And one of the gifts that that Mr. Rogers brought into the home, and some of you may remember, was the ability to bring emotional language and nomenclature and awareness into the household. Not just didactics, not just the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s and how quickly you learn to achieve whatever milestone, but what it's like to be angry or mad or confused or not understand. And, you know, as he said, little by little, we human beings are confronted with situations that give us more and more clues that we aren't perfect. And as he was told, you know, by his grandfather earlier on in his life, that, you know, you are wonderful just the way you are. There's no one else in the whole wide world like you. And Fred McFeely Rogers, as he says here in this beautiful image and slide, you know, I think everybody longs to be loved and longs to know that he or she is lovable. And consequently, the greatest thing we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. And the conversation that we've had today, remarkably circular. Like and I'm aware of that, and it sort of is a circular conversation. It's ethereal. You can't quite pin it down in a lot of ways because human beings aren't pinned down. We're not able to stereotype and, you know, and absolutely say you're this way or you're that way. And so folks who might find themselves or feel on the margins may need some intentional space created for him or her to be able to say, I don't understand, I need help. I want to know. And I believe that were he still with us, and again, as a Rogerian, that right now Mr. Rogers would be one of those folks standing with us trying to figure out how to help best these folks who have been left on the side. So there are resources that NIDA has provided here, and I encourage you to find them, to use them, to seek them out, because they're incredible, really. I mean, really, really incredible, and can give you a lot of information. And I've talked far too much, which is not unexpected and one of my flaws. And now I will hand it back over to Ellen and all of you wonderful NIDA folk.
Thank you so much, Chase and Troy and Ryan. And before I just quickly go through these resources, I want to invite everyone to type in your questions or raise your hand. We do have a couple more minutes for questions, so please feel free to do that now. So just quickly, some of our resources, how to get involved and learn about eating disorders. The 2014 NIDA Awareness Week is coming up, February 23rd it starts, and you can go on to NIDAawareness.org. We have a ton of information on there, ideas and planning guides, articles, infographics, webinars, ways to get involved. Please check that out. It's the largest outreach effort in the nation. We also have our Parent, Family, and Friends Network publication, Making Connections. You can find that on the NIDA website, mynida.org, under the Media tab on the Making Connections page. We also have our webinar series, including a gender identity, sexuality, and eating disorders webinar. That is as well on our site under the Media tab on the webinars page. We have our annual NIDA conference coming up in San Antonio, Texas, October 16th and 18th, Thinking Big, Uniting Families and Professionals in the Fight Against Eating Disorders. Also check out Gerza Books at www.bulimia.com. There's a lot of publications and books about eating disorders. Getting help, please. NIDA's information and referral helpline, 1-800-931-2237, or you can do the click to chat option. When you call, please request information and treatment referrals specific to LGBT communities. We have that available, and we have our helpline volunteers ready to help you. NIDA navigators, our volunteers have personal experience with an eating disorder. And if you would like to be connected to a NIDA navigator, you can email the PFF network at mynida.org, and we will definitely set that up for you. And don't forget about our NIDA toolkits, including the Parent Toolkit, Educator Toolkit, Coach and Athletic Toolkit. They have a ton of information about eating disorders, treatment options, how to support your child, insurance issues, and much more. And so we do have just a few minutes, but I do have some questions that have come in. And I think I'll start with this. What can families do to best support a loved one who is struggling with their sexuality or their gender identity issues? I don't know if Troy and Ryan, you would like to start with that?
Okay, well, I'll start. It's always that awkward pause. I don't know who's going to go first. I think, one, just letting the family member know that you're there for them, that you support them, but also being able to be patient and give them their space to continue to explore and find comfort in who they are, because this is a process for not only the family but also the individual. And it's a very scary process to go through.
Thank you. And this also, this next question or comment actually goes along with that from an attendee. I have grown up in a very homophobic, biased community, and I want to ask for help for my eating disorder and support, but how can I? I don't know, Troy, if you'd like to speak to that.
Well, I would just say I don't know, the logistics of this particular situation, but one of the best things you can definitely do, and I have found with my personal experience, is that reaching out to, whether it's another someone either within the school system, I don't know the age of this individual, or a peer group, or a faith-based organization, or something of the like that is open and affirming and is willing, maybe not necessarily to do everything for you, but is there, as Ryan did say, to listen, to be patient, and help you through the process, and maybe refer you on to other resources within your community. I would just say that if you know you are struggling, you know you are going through this, that's the first step. And the next step, I think, is figuring out how to take care of yourself and making sure that you locate a resource that you feel comfortable enough to speak with.
Great. Thank you so much, Troy. And we have another question here. Where can I find hope other than in my past or current size, I think is what it says. What steps should I take daily to be healthy? What policies are possibly will there be to help prevent them from developing an eating disorder? So I think maybe the first part of that question is where can I find hope? And maybe we can talk a little bit about what steps this person can take daily to recover from their eating disorder. And maybe Chase, you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Yes,
Chase, are you there?
I had to come at, I was. I had to figure out how to come off of mute because my technological prowess failed me yet again. The daily steps are here, as for many of us, is one, to look to the resources that are around you that may not be seen early on as resources. It might be music. It might be a pet or an animal. It might be, drink a cup of coffee and reading the paper in the morning at a local coffee shop. Those can be sort of instantiations and moments of joy, of peace, of calm. Being able to learn how, that the work of mindfulness is hard work. That's part of dialectical behavior therapy, is that work of mindfulness building. It's hard work, but there is a wonderful part of DBT called distress tolerance that is, really squarely meant. How do I make it through? How, on those days when I'm having a tough day, and that certainly applies to every single person who's been on this phone call today, there are moments when we've all felt a tragic dearth of hope, and sometimes it's to the little things. And I would say, again, shameless plug for me back to Fred McFeely Rogers. He would say that his mom said to him, "Look for the helpers, Freddie. Look for the helpers. They're there."
Thank you so much, Chase. And I know we're out of time. I want to respect everyone's time. So just a huge thank you to Chase Banister, Troy Roness, and Ryan Sallans for this wonderful and informative webinar, and for all of you out there for taking the time to be with us today. And you will receive a short questionnaire by email about this webinar, and we really appreciate you just taking a minute to offer your feedback. We'd like to hear from you on how we can change and improve these webinars. And if you have ideas for future webinars, feel free to let us know through this survey, or you can email me directly, edomingos@nationaleatingdisorders.org. But thank you again all for being here, and thank you to our wonderful presenters. And we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
What a privilege. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.